Is this some kind of joke? The question, sharp with condescending disbelief, cut through the low hum of the hangar's fluorescent lights. Staff Sergeant Miller, a man whose crisp uniform and confident posture screamed digital age proficiency, held a data tablet in one hand and gestured dismissively with the other. We called the depot for a Tier 4 specialist, not a museum exhibit. Stanley Burns, 83 years old, said nothing. He stood just inside the massive hangar, a small, stooped figure dwarfed by the cavernous space and the menacing silhouette of the A-10 Thunderbolt II that sat stubbornly silent in its center. He wore simple denim overalls over a flannel shirt, the clothes of a man who still worked with his hands. His own hands, gnarled with age and spotted with time, were clasped loosely in front of him. His eyes, a pale but startlingly clear blue, weren't on the arrogant young sergeant. They were fixed on the plane. He took a slow step forward, the soft scuff of his worn work boots echoing slightly on the polished concrete floor. The airmen gathered around the Warthog, a team of a half-dozen technicians in their early 20s, exchanged smirks and rolled their eyes. Miller let out an exasperated sigh. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to remain by the entrance. This is an active maintenance area for a critical flight asset." His tone was the one you'd use on a child who had wandered into the street, or what's left of one anyway. Stanley's gaze traced the lines of the A-10, from the blunt nose housing the GAU-8 Avenger cannon to the twin tails angled high in the air. He saw past the matte gray paint and the stenciled serial numbers. He saw the soul of the machine. It was wounded. He finally turned his gaze to Sergeant Miller. "What's she telling you?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Miller scoffed, tapping his tablet with an aggressive finger. "She's telling us a lot of things, old-timer. The ECU is failing to handshake with the digital throttle quadrant. The MIL-LSTD 1553 data bus is throwing a cascade of fault codes we can't trace. We've hot-swapped every relevant line-replaceable unit from the DAS to the CICU. We've run diagnostics for 72 straight hours. The bird is dead in the water, and we're supposed to be on a deployment rotation in 5 days. He rattled off the acronyms like a priest reciting a liturgy, a litany of modern problems for a modern aircraft. Stanley nodded slowly, absorbing the information without looking at the glowing screen. He walked toward the aircraft, his pace unhurried. Miller stepped in his path, placing a hand out to physically block him. "Whoa there, Grandpa. I need to see your credentials. You can't just walk up and touch a $30 million piece of hardware." Stanley stopped. He didn't seem offended. He just seemed patient. He reached into the back pocket of his overalls and pulled out a simple, cracked leather wallet. From it, he produced a faded, laminated ID card. It was an old civil service credential, the photo showing a much younger man with the same clear eyes. Miller snatched it, his eyes scanning it with practiced suspicion. "Stanley Burns, civilian consultant?" He looked up from the card, his expression a perfect mask of incredulity. "What are you going to do? Tell it a bedtime story from the good old days?" A few of the younger airmen snickered. Stanley simply reached down and picked up a small canvas tool roll he had set by his feet. He began to unroll it on a nearby workbench. The tools inside were not the gleaming laser-etched instruments the other mechanics used. They were old, their steel darkened with the patina of age, their wooden and plastic handles worn smooth from decades of use. They looked like something you'd find in the bottom of a forgotten toolbox. "What in the world is that?" Miller asked, his voice dripping with derision. "Are those hand-forged? What are you planning on doing, hitting the turbine with a hammer?" "Sir, this is a controlled environment. We use calibrated, certified equipment, not artifacts." He pointed a finger at a strangely shaped wrench, its head bent at an unusual angle. "I'm pretty sure that thing doesn't even exist in the standard toolkit." The airmen moved closer, their curiosity mixing with their amusement. It felt like a break from the maddening frustration of the last 3 days. This old man and his ancient tools were a welcome, if bizarre, distraction. Stanley picked up the odd wrench, his gnarled fingers closing around it with a familiar comfort. The weight of it was a known quantity, a part of him. "Sometimes the standard toolkit is the problem," Stanley said, his voice quiet but carrying in the vast space. He looked at the access panel near the A-10's main landing gear strut. "Did you check the hydraulic pressure regulator's bypass valve manually?" Miller threw his hands up in the air. "Manually?" The system diagnostics cleared the entire hydraulic loop. "The pressure is nominal. It's an electronic issue, a software ghost in the machine. It's not something you can fix with a rusty piece of metal from the Stone Age." "The diagnostics can lie," Stanley said, his gaze unwavering. "They only see what they're told to look for." He took a step toward the plane again, the strange wrench held loosely in his hand. Miller's face hardened, his patience, already thin, snapped. "That's it. You are not authorized to be here. and you are certainly not authorized to touch this aircraft. You are interfering with United States Air Force property." As Miller's voice rose, the hangar's acoustics amplifying his anger, the scene around Stanley began to blur. The sneering face of the young sergeant, the gleam of the fluorescent lights off the Warthog's fuselage, the low hum of electricity, it all started to fade, replaced by a different sound, a different light. The roar of jet engines on a dusty, sun-baked airstrip. The frantic shouts of men under pressure. The air was thick with the smell of sand and burning fuel. A younger Stanley, his face caked with grime and sweat, was wedged deep inside the mangled engine cowling of an F-4 Phantom. The same uniquely shaped wrench was in his hand, its strange angle the only thing allowing him to reach a sheared bolt deep within the machinery. Outside, his crew chief was screaming, "We gotta go now, Stan. They're walking the mortars in." The ground shook with a distant crump. He ignored it, his focus absolute. With a final desperate turn, the bolt seated. He scrambled out of the engine bay, giving a thumbs up. "Fire it up." The engine sputtered, coughed black smoke, and then caught with a deafening shriek. The Phantom began to taxi before he was even clear of the wing. He stood on the perforated steel planking of the runway, his chest heaving, the wrench still clutched in his hand, feeling its familiar life-saving weight. The memory vanished as quickly as it came. He was back in the sterile, quiet hangar. Sergeant Miller was still talking, his face now red with anger. "And I will have you escorted off this base by security forces if you take one more step." From the edge of the group of onlookers, a young woman, Airman Davis, watched the confrontation with a growing sense of unease. She was new to the unit, still learning the ropes, but she knew injustice when she saw it. She had seen the name on the work order, Stanley Burns, summoned by General Thompson himself, and she saw the way her sergeant, a man she respected for his technical skill, was treating this quiet, dignified old man. It was wrong. It was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Miller's arrogance had now tipped into outright bullying. He was puffed up with his own authority, enjoying the audience of his subordinates. "We have protocols for a reason, sir, to protect the equipment, to protect people like you from getting in over your head. This isn't a propeller plane from the 1940s. That was the last straw for Davis. While Miller was busy trying to intimidate the unmovable old man, she slipped away from the group, her heart pounding. She found an unused maintenance alcove hidden behind a stack of spare parts crates. She pulled out her personal cell phone, her fingers flying across the screen. She didn't have the general's number, but she had the next best thing. She called the direct line for the Wing's Command Chief Master Sergeant, a man she'd met once during her in-processing briefing, a man known for his no-nonsense attitude and his fierce loyalty to his airmen, past and present. His aide answered, "Command Chief's office. This is Airman Davis from the 355th Maintenance Squadron," she said, her voice low and urgent. "I need to speak with him. It's an emergency." There was a pause. "What kind of emergency, Airman?" "It's about Mr. Stanley Burns, ma'am. He's down here in Hangar 4. General Thompson sent him, and Sergeant Miller is about to have him arrested." The line went silent. Not a disconnected silence, but a heavy, profound quiet that spoke volumes. Davis could hear the faint sound of a chair scraping back, of muffled but urgent words spoken away from the receiver. The audience, now privy to this secret call, could feel the first tremor of an impending earthquake. Help was on the way. The balance of power was about to shift, and Sergeant Miller, blissfully unaware, was about to be buried under it. Inside the Wing Command building, the Command Chief Master Sergeant hung up the phone, his face ashen. He didn't hesitate. He didn't bother with the intercom. He moved with a speed that belied his age and rank, striding down the carpeted hallway and bursting into the office of General Thompson without knocking. The general, a two-star with a chest full of ribbons and an air of perpetual impatience, looked up from a stack of briefing documents, his eyes flashing with annoyance at the breach of protocol. "What is it, Chief?" "General, we have a code red situation in Hangar 4. Thompson's posture stiffened. "A fire? An active shooter? What?" "Worse, sir," the chief said, his voice grim. "It's Stanley Burns. You sent for him to look at the grounded A-10. The general nodded. "I did. The best man for the job." "Did he figure it out?" "He hasn't had the chance, sir. The NCO in charge, a Staff Sergeant Miller, is refusing him access to the aircraft. According to the airman who called me, he's been mocking him, insulting him, and is currently threatening to have him arrested by security forces." The transformation in General Thompson was immediate and terrifying. The bureaucratic annoyance vanished, replaced by a glacial fury that seemed to drop the temperature in the room. He stood up, his chair scraping back harshly. He grabbed his service cap from its stand, settling it perfectly on his head in one smooth, angry motion. "Get my vehicle," he commanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Now, get the wing commander on the radio and tell him to meet me at Hangar 4 in 5 minutes." And pull the service record and performance reviews for a Staff Sergeant Miller. I want to see them on my tablet before we arrive." The chief was already out the door, his voice echoing down the hall as he barked orders into his radio. The audience knew what was coming. The gears of justice were now grinding, and they were turning against the arrogant sergeant in the hangar. Back in Hangar 4, Sergeant Miller had reached the apex of his self-importance. Stanley Burns had not moved, had not responded to his threats. He just stood there, his quiet dignity, a silent rebuke that infuriated Miller more than any argument could have. "All right, that's it, old man," Miller said, finally pulling his radio from his belt. "You've had your little field trip on calling security forces. Maybe a nice chat with them in a holding cell will remind you what happens when unauthorized civilians wander onto a secure flight line." He held the radio to his mouth, his thumb hovering over the transmit button. "This is for your own good. We can't have you getting hurt or breaking something we can't fix." It was the ultimate act of condescension, the final unforgivable insult. He was framing his own arrogance as a form of protection, casting Stanley as a doddering old fool who needed to be saved from himself. The other airmen shifted uncomfortably. The joke wasn't funny anymore. Just as Miller's thumb depressed the button, a sound from outside the hangar overrode the quiet hum within. It wasn't the distant drone of a jet. It was the high-pitched, insistent whine of sirens, growing louder at an alarming rate. And it wasn't just one siren, it was a chorus of them, converging on their position. Every head in the hangar turned toward the massive corrugated steel doors. With a low groan, the doors began to slide open, flooding the dimly lit space with the brilliant, unforgiving light of the afternoon sun. Silhouetted against the glare was a black command vehicle flanked by 2 military police trucks, their lights flashing silently. They screeched to a halt just outside the hangar entrance. The driver's side door of the command car flew open and out stepped General Thompson, his expression a mask of controlled rage. He was followed a second later by the wing commander, a full-bird colonel whose face was a mixture of confusion and dread. The airmen who had been lounging and smirking moments before snapped to attention with a collective clatter of boots on concrete. Sergeant Miller froze, the radio still in his hand, his mouth agape. His entire world had just tilted on its axis. General Thompson strode into the hangar, his polished shoes clicking an angry rhythm on the floor. He didn't even glance at Miller or the other stunned technicians. His eyes were locked on one person. He walked directly to Stanley Burns, stopped 2 feet in front of him, and executed the sharpest, most impeccably respectful salute Miller had ever witnessed. It was a salute reserved for heroes, for presidents, for men of immense stature. "Mr. Burns," the general's voice boomed, sharp and clear. "It is an honor, sir. I apologize profoundly for the reception you have received on my base." Stanley, who had remained unmoved by Miller's tirades, seemed to shrink slightly under the weight of the formal respect. He gave a slow, tired nod of acknowledgement. The salute was returned with a simple gesture, not a military one, but one of mutual understanding. Then General Thompson turned, his body moving with the precision of a striking snake. His icy gaze swept over the ramrod-straight airman and finally settled on Sergeant Miller, pinning him in place. "Do you have any idea who this is?" The general's voice was deceptively calm, yet it carried an edge of tempered steel that made every person in the hangar flinch. Miller could only shake his head, his face pale. "This," the general announced, his voice rising to fill the cavernous space, "is Chief Master Sergeant Stanley Burns, retired. This man has more hours working on combat aircraft than every single one of you has been alive, combined." He took a step toward the silent A-10, running a hand along its wing as if it were a prized thoroughbred. When this aircraft was still on the drawing board, Stanley Burns was in a jungle, keeping phantoms flying with nothing but scavenged parts and sheer genius. When the GAU-8 Avengers ammunition feed system kept jamming in high-G maneuvers, the engineers at Fairchild Republic couldn't solve it. They sent the blueprints to Chief Burns, who was in the field, and he redesigned the feed chute mechanism on the back of a napkin, a design they still use to this day. He turned back to the crowd, his eyes blazing. He wrote the book, the actual classified technical manual on combat turnaround maintenance for this airframe. He did it by hand in a tent during Desert Storm while rockets were landing on his airfield. The schematics you're looking at on your $10,000 ruggedized tablets, he drew the originals, with a pencil, in a war zone. The general took a final menacing step toward Miller. "This aircraft isn't just a machine to him, it is his legacy. It is his child. And you," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more terrifying than a shout, "have just insulted a living legend on his own child's sickbed." A profound, shamed silence descended upon the hangar. The smirks were long gone, replaced by expressions of disbelief, awe, and deep burning embarrassment. Airman Davis felt a tear of vindication trace a path down her cheek. The truth was out, and it was more glorious than she could have imagined. The wing commander stepped forward, his face grim. "Sergeant Miller, you're with me." The words were a death sentence for Miller's career, and he knew it. He followed the colonel out of the hangar like a man walking to his own execution. General Thompson's posture relaxed slightly as he turned back to Stanley. "Stan, from the bottom of my heart, I am so sorry. There's no excuse for that kind of ignorance." Stanley simply shook his head, a flicker of sadness in his clear blue eyes. He looked at the remaining young airmen, who were now staring at him as if he were a ghost from their history books. "They're good kids, General. Just proud," Stanley said, his gravelly voice filled with a surprising lack of malice. "They trust the machine more than the man. They've been taught to follow what the screen tells them." He looked at the silent Warthog. "But the plane has a soul. It makes noises, it groans, it vibrates. You can't find that on a screen. You have to listen to it. You have to feel it." He unrolled his canvas kit again, the greasy, familiar smell of old oil and steel filling the air. He picked up a different tool this time, a simple-looking screwdriver with a dark wooden handle, worn smooth and dark with the sweat and oil of decades. He held it up for a moment, his thumb stroking the worn wood. The pristine hangar dissolved. He was 20 years old again, a young airman with slicked back hair, standing in a hangar much like this one, but filled with the thunderous radial engines of propeller planes. A grizzled, pot-bellied chief master sergeant, a man who had worked on B-17s in the skies over Europe, was pressing this very screwdriver into his hand. "This was my father's," the old chief had said, his voice thick with emotion. "He used it to build furniture. I used it to fix fortresses. Now it's yours. Remember, son, it's not about the tool. It's about the hands that hold it and the knowledge passed down with it. Don't ever forget that." The memory faded, leaving the old screwdriver feeling warm in his hand. He walked to the A-10, the crowd of awestruck airmen parting before him like the Red Sea. He didn't plug in a diagnostic computer or consult a tablet. He simply knelt by the main landing gear, placing his free hand flat against the cold metal of the fuselage. He closed his eyes for a moment, just feeling. Then he used the wooden handle of the screwdriver to tap gently on a small, unassuming access panel. His head tilted, listening intently to the resonance of each tap. After a few moments, he stopped. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "It's a harmonic vibration," he announced to no one in particular. "There must be a microfracture in the mounting bracket for the hydraulic accumulator. Every time the APU spools up, it throws the pressure sensors off by a fraction of a percent. Too small for the diagnostics to flag as an error, but enough to make the flight control computer refuse to initialize the engines." He looked up at the young airman Davis. "Hand me a torque wrench, please. A half-inch drive." She practically ran to get it. He took the wrench, attached a socket, and reached deep inside the landing gear well. There was a single soft click as he made a minute adjustment, no more than an eighth of a turn. He pulled the wrench out, wiped his hands on an old rag from his pocket, and stood up, his knees cracking softly. "Try her now," he said quietly. All eyes turned to Airman Davis, who with a nod from the general climbed the ladder into the cockpit. She strapped herself in, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the engine start sequence switches. She looked down at Stanley, who gave her a reassuring nod. She took a deep breath and flipped the first switch. For a second there was only the familiar whine of the auxiliary power unit. Then a low rumble started deep within the aircraft, a sound they hadn't heard in days. The rumble grew into a deep guttural roar as the A-10's twin General Electric engines spooled to life, their iconic sound filling the hangar with a thunderous, beautiful noise. The Warthog was alive. The airmen erupted in a spontaneous cheer, a wave of pure relief and joy. In the weeks that followed, a memo from General Thompson's office mandated a new monthly training module for the entire maintenance wing. It was called Lessons from the Legends, a program where retired veterans were brought in to share their hands-on, hard-won knowledge with the new generation of technicians. The first lecture, of course, was delivered by Chief Master Sergeant Stanley Burns, who stood not at a podium but beside an open engine cowling, his old canvas tool roll spread out before him. Several months later, in a quiet diner on the edge of town, Stanley Burns sat alone at the counter, stirring a cup of black coffee. The bell over the door chimed, and a young man in civilian clothes walked in. He was no longer a sergeant. His uniform now bore the stripes of a corporal. It was Miller. He saw Stanley, hesitated for a long moment, then walked over. He didn't offer a grand, dramatic apology. He simply slid onto the stool next to the old man. "Sir," he began, his voice quiet and humbled. "I was wondering if you had a minute. Could you tell me what it was like working on the F-4 Phantoms? Stanley stopped stirring his coffee. He turned and looked at the young man, a genuine warm smile spreading across his face. Well, he said, his eyes twinkling with memory. It all started on a hot, dusty airstrip in a place called Da Nang. The greatest tools in any hangar are not found in a toolbox. They are experience, humility, and respect. If you were inspired by the story of Stanley Burns, please hit the like button, share this video with a friend, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more incredible stories of unassuming heroes.